Welcome to Kiss and Chapters, where every story begins with a spark and ends with a swoon. If you love heart-fluttering romances, unexpected twists, and characters you'll root for, you're in the right place. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so I can keep bringing you more sweet, emotional, and unforgettable stories. Let's fall in love with every chapter, together. Chapter 1. The Gilded Cage Remembered. The last thing Lin Xing remembered was the sound of her own heartbeat, a slow, lonely drum in the overwhelming silence of her opulent rooms. In her first life, she had died as she had lived for 20 years, surrounded by exquisite beauty and utter solitude. The air had been thick with the scent of rare sandalwood and the crushing weight of absence. Her merchant husband, Jiang Feng, was away, always away on another trip, securing another fortune that meant nothing to her. The servants' whispers about his entertainments in distant port cities were the only company she had. She was the centerpiece of a beautiful empty display, her vibrancy slowly leaching away until nothing was left but a well-dressed ghost. She had died not with a gasp but with a sigh of profound relief. She awoke with a jolt, gasping for air as if breaking the surface of a deep lake. The silence was gone, replaced by the familiar, comforting sounds of her childhood home. Her mother's voice, sharp and decisive, echoing from the hallway. An exceptional offer. Do you understand the prestige, girl? The Jiang family's wealth is immense. You will wear silks finer than the magistrate's wife. The words were a punch to the gut. The Jiang family. Panic, pure and undiluted, seized her. She scrambled from her bed, her young, strong limbs feeling alien and frantic. She saw her reflection in the polished bronze mirror 15 years old again, her face flushed with sleep and terror, not the pale, hollow-cheeked woman she had become. Not again. I cannot do it again. The memory of that endless, echoing loneliness was a physical pain. She would rather throw herself from the city walls than be sold into that gilded cage once more. The proposal was a death sentence. Her first instinct was to run. To refuse. To scream until her voice gave out. But the memory of her mother's ambition was a stone wall. Her feelings were irrelevant. She was a daughter, an asset to be traded. A different memory surfaced, a fleeting image of her elder sister, Lin Yu, pale and trembling as their mother praised the scholar, Shen Wei. The look of utter devastation on her sister's face had been so stark it had cut through Lin Xing's own panic. Jijia. Without a second thought, fueled by a desperation that overrode all propriety, she ran from her room. She burst into Lin Yu's chamber without knocking and found a mirror image of her own terror. The shared, knowing look between them confirmed the impossible. They had both returned. In the sanctuary of the garden, their whispered confessions were a torrent of shared grief. Lin Xing spoke of her aching neglect, of years spent waiting for a husband who saw her as another acquisition. Lin Yu spoke of her silent despair, of a marriage that was a beautiful frozen tomb. And from that shared desperation, a wild, insane idea was born. What if we exchanged them? The plan was a lifeline. Marrying the scholar Shen Wei was a leap into the unknown, but the unknown was infinitely preferable to the known hell of her first life. His world would be quiet, yes. But he would be present. That had to be better than a phantom husband, hadn't it? Now, standing in the receiving hall as her mother presented the 2 betrothal boxes, the reality of her gamble felt like standing on the edge of a cliff. She watched Lin Yu open the merchant's gift, the warm, lavish gold, and saw the flicker of fear in her sister's eyes. Then it was her turn. Her fingers, usually so steady, trembled as she lifted the lid of the Zeatonwood box. Inside, on a bed of austere dark silk, lay a hairpin of pure white jade, carved into a single upright stalk of bamboo. It was cold, severe, a symbol of unyielding principles and scholarly resolve. It was everything her vibrant, chaotic spirit was not. He picked it up. It was lighter than the merchant's gold, but it felt infinitely heavier. This was not a gift, it was an expectation. A blueprint for the woman she was supposed to become. She looked at the pin, then at her sister, who now held the warm gold of a different future. Lin Xing's jaw tightened. She had chosen this path to escape a cage. She would not let this cold jade become another set of bars. She closed her fingers around the hairpin. It was cool and smooth against her palm. It was just a pin. And she was Lin Xing. She had already lived one life in silence. This time she would make herself heard. Chapter 2. The Scholar's Bewilderment. The Zeatonwood box sat on Lin Xing's dressing table, a dark, solemn accusation. The jade hairpin within was no longer just an object. It was a symbol of the rigid, silent future she had chosen. Every time she looked at it, a fresh wave of doubt threatened to drown her. Had she escaped a gilded cage only to willingly walk into a stone one? The formal request for a meeting arrived, its script precise and elegant on stark white paper. Scholar Shen Wei requested the honor of her presence in the Lin family's main hall to take tea. The formality of it felt like a first test, and Lin Xing's rebellious spirit bristled. On the day of, her mother fussed over her, selecting a high-collared robe of muted gray-green silk, a color meant to suggest tranquility and erudition. "Remember, Xing," Madame Wang admonished, taming a flyaway strand of Lin Xing's hair with a firm hand. "Speak only when spoken to. Be demure. Show him the refinement he will expect. No foolishness." Refinement. Lin Xing felt like a songbird being forced into the shape of a book. She took a steadying breath, her fingers unconsciously tracing the vibrant embroidery on her sleeve, hidden beneath the outer robe. She would be demure. She would be quiet. She would show this scholar exactly what he expected to see. She was led into the hall. Her father stood stiffly by the window. And then he arrived. Shen Wei was exactly as she remembered from her fleeting glimpses in her first life. Tall and lean, his posture so straight it seemed to defy the very pull of the earth. His robes were of a fine but unadorned dark fabric, and his face was all sharp angles and severe lines as if carved from ice. His eyes, when they briefly met hers, were the color of winter twilight and held not a flicker of warmth, only a cool, assessing scrutiny. He bowed to her parents with a stiff, economical grace that spoke of practiced ritual, not genuine respect. Then his gaze landed on her. Lin Xing performed the flawless, deep curtsy she had been drilled in since childhood, her eyes downcast. She could feel his gaze like a physical weight, dissecting her, cataloging her. "Miss Lin," he said. His voice was as she remembered, clipped, precise, and devoid of any emotion that might be considered wasteful. It was the voice of a man reading a legal document. The tea was poured. The air was thick with a silence more oppressive than any noise. Her father made stilted conversation about the unseasonably cool spring, and Shen Wei offered a curt agreement, citing a historical precedent for such weather patterns from a dynasty 500 years past. Lin Xing kept her eyes on her lap, her hands folded neatly. She was playing her part perfectly. Inside she was screaming. His attention turned to her, a clear, deliberate shift in the room's energy. It was her turn to be examined. "Miss Lin," he began, and she could hear the unspoken expectation in his tone. "Recite something virtuous. Mention your embroidery. Prove you are the placid, cultured wife I require." A spark of defiance, hot and bright, flared in her chest. She would not recite. She would not mention embroidery. "Do you find the historical records to be entirely accurate, Scholar Shen?" she asked, her voice soft but clear, her eyes lifting to meet his. The question landed in the silent room like a dropped plate. Her father choked on his tea. Her mother's smile froze into a rictus of horror. Shen Wei's brows drew together infinitesimally. It was the most emotion she had seen on his face. "An unusual question for a young lady," he stated, his tone implying it was an unwelcome one. "Is it?" Lin Xing pressed, the demure mask slipping just a fraction. She remembered a fierce debate he would have years from now, a cornerstone of his academic reputation, centered on the biased historiography of a certain victorious emperor. "I only wonder if the writers, being subjects of the emperor, might have been inclined to polish the truth. To make a ruthless decision seem strategic. To turn a massacre into a necessary victory." There was a beat of dead silence. Shen Wei was staring at her now, not through her. His wintry eyes were wide with something akin to shock. It was not the topic, it was the source. A mere girl voicing a complex historiographical critique he himself privately wrestled with. "The integrity of the historical canon is not a matter for casual speculation," he said finally, his voice even colder than before, "a defense mechanism against the utterly unexpected." "Of course," Lin Xing said, dipping her head in a show of deference that felt like a victory. Forgive my foolish curiosity. She allowed the faintest, most innocent smile to touch her lips. I merely thought that if the brush can be mightier than the sword, it must also be wielded with immense care, lest it write lies instead of history. She had just perfectly paraphrased the central argument of his future famous essay back to him. Shen Wei's cup halted halfway to his lips. He looked utterly derailed. The script for this meeting, the inspection of a quiet, suitable bride, was in tatters at his feet. He had expected a blank page. He had been presented with a confounding annotated margin. He did not know what to do with her. The meeting concluded shortly after with stiff, formal pleasantries. He left without looking at her again, his retreating back the very picture of bewildered affront. As soon as he was gone, her mother rounded on her. Lin Xing, what were you thinking? You have ruined everything. But Lin Xing was not listening. Her heart was hammering, but not with fear. With exhilaration. She had done it. She had thrown a stone into his perfectly still pond. She had seen past the icy scholar to the man beneath. A man who cared so deeply about the truth that the mere suggestion of its fragility could unnerve him. He was not what she had expected. He was more. And he was for the first time in either of her lives looking at her. She hadn't made him happy. She had made him think. A slow, defiant smile spread across Lin Xing's face. She picked up the jade hairpin from the table where her mother had discarded it in frustration. A stone cage, perhaps. But she had just proven she had teeth. And she was not afraid to use them to chip away at the walls. Chapter 3, The First Frost. The Lin household was a mausoleum of suppressed anxiety in the days following the disastrous meeting. Madame Wang vacillated between furious lectures and despairing sighs, certain the esteemed Shen family would withdraw their proposal, leaving her most difficult daughter a publicly humiliated burden. Lin Xing, however, felt a strange, simmering calm. The initial panic had been burned away by the fire of her own defiance. She had faced the dragon in its den and had not been eaten. She had merely annoyed it. That felt like a victory. When the Shen family's response finally arrived, it was not a withdrawal. It was a coldly worded agreement, noting that while Miss Lin's demeanor was unconventional, the Shen family would honor the rearranged arrangement. The letter dripped with condescension, making it clear this was a favor granted to the Lin family, not a mutually celebrated union. The betrothal was sealed. The jade hairpin was hers. The wedding day was a study in contrasts to Lin Yu's vibrant send-off. The ceremonies were subdued, the colors more austere, the music traditional and somber. Lin Xing was dressed not in exuberant crimson, but in layers of heavy, embroidered silk in shades of deep blue and silver, her face painted into a mask of serene obedience. She felt like a prize sow being presented at a county fair. She was loaded into a sedan chair and carried away from the only home she'd ever known, not towards the bustling energy of the merchant's compound, but into the heart of the city's scholarly district. When the chair was set down and the door opened, the first thing that struck her was the silence. It was absolute. Oppressive. There were no bustling servants, no distant clatter from kitchens, no laughter. The air itself felt still and heavy, as if the very dust motes were afraid to dance in the sunlight. The Shen compound was a series of interconnected buildings surrounding stark, perfectly manicured courtyards. Every rock, every bamboo stalk, was placed with an intention that felt more like a restriction than art. She was met not by her new husband, but by a stern-faced steward whose posture was almost as rigid as Shen Wei's. "Welcome, Madame Shen," he intoned, his voice low and devoid of inflection. "The master is in his study. He has instructed that you be shown to your quarters. He will take his evening meal alone." And that was that. No welcome. No ceremony. She was simply deposited. Her quarters were a mirror of the rest of the compound. Spacious, impeccably clean, and utterly devoid of personality. The furniture was dark, heavy, and functional. The shelves held a few classic texts, arranged with geometric precision. There was a writing desk, bare save for a perfect inkstone and a selection of brushes, all standing at attention. It was a room that expected nothing of her but her absence. This was it. This was the silence she had chosen. It pressed in on her from all sides, a physical weight on her chest. She walked to the window and looked out at the perfect empty courtyard. This was her life now. A beautiful, silent, endless waiting room. The fear returned then, cold and sharp. Had she made a catastrophic mistake? The merchant's neglect had been an active, painful thing. This felt like being erased. She was a splash of color on a monochrome scroll, and she could feel the compound's inherent austerity trying to bleach her out. Days bled into one another. Shen Wei was a ghost in his own home. She would catch glimpses of him moving between his study and the library, his face forever locked in an expression of deep concentration. He took his meals in his study. He did not seek her out. The few times they passed in a hallway, he would give her a curt, distant nod, as if acknowledging a mildly inconvenient piece of furniture that had recently been delivered. Her attempts to engage the servants were met with polite, nervous deflection. They were trained to be invisible to maintain the silence. Her vibrancy was a disruption to the natural order of things, and it made them uncomfortable. Lin Xing felt her spirit, the very core of her that she had fought to protect, beginning to shrink. The silence was a constant assault. She tried humming to herself just to break it, but the sound felt sacrilegious and died in her throat. One afternoon, driven mad by the quiet, she ventured into the main courtyard and began to rearrange a few of the potted plants, wanting to create a more lively, asymmetrical grouping. She had barely touched the second pot when the steward materialized at her side, as if summoned by the whisper of disruption. "The master prefers the arrangement to remain as it is, madam," he said, his tone not unkind but firm. "It is designed for contemplation." Tears of frustration pricked at her eyes. She retreated to her room, feeling defeated. This was worse than she had imagined. Jiang Feng's absence had been a void. Shen Wei's presence was a wall. A cold, immovable wall of ice that she was constantly, silently bumping up against. She was trapped. Not in a cage of gold but in a fortress of ice. And she was freezing to death. Picking up the jade hairpin from her dressing table, she held its cold, smooth weight in her palm. It was a perfect symbol of this place. Beautiful, hard, and utterly inflexible. She had wanted to be heard. But here, in this silent, perfect tomb of scholarship, it seemed she was meant to be neither seen nor heard. He was simply meant to cease to exist. The first frost of her new life had settled deep into her bones, and she feared no spring would ever come to melt it. Chapter 4. The Walls of the Study. The frost within the Shen compound did not thaw. It hardened into a permanent winter. Lin Xing moved through her days like a ghost haunting a library. The silence was no longer just an absence of sound. It was an active presence, a weight that pressed down on her chest, making each breath an effort. She was drowning in a sea of stillness. He tried to fill it. She attempted to chat with the maid who brought her meals, asking about her family, about the markets. The girl would answer in monosyllables, her eyes wide with a fear that Lin Xing realized was directed at her, or rather at the master's displeasure if he heard his wife engaging in frivolous talk. She tried to sing softly while arranging her hair, but the notes sounded thin and alien in the dead air, and she soon gave up. Her spirit, once so large and vibrant, felt like it was being folded into a smaller and smaller box. This was the true cost of her choice. She had escaped the loneliness of invisibility for the suffocation of irrelevance. At least in her first life, her golden cage had been spacious. This was a cell. He watched Shen Wei. It was all she could do. She observed his rigid routines from her window. His pre-dawn walk through the barren courtyards, his retreat to his study, his emergence only for the most necessary meals, which were taken alone. He was a man who had built a fortress around himself, and she was locked outside the walls. The memory of her first life knowledge felt like a cruel joke here. What use was knowing about future market fluctuations or court gossip in this temple of the past? Her world had shrunk to these four walls, this perfect, desolate garden. Then a memory surfaced. Not of her past life with Jiang Feng, but of a conversation she'd overheard between her father and a visiting scholar years ago. They had spoken of Shen Wei's legendary, almost obsessive search for a complete copy of the Garden of Ancients, a rare multi-volume commentary on a classic philosophical text. It was his life's white whale. In her first life, he had finally acquired a damaged, incomplete set after a decade of searching. The thought arrived fully formed, a desperate gambit from a cornered mind. It was a risk. A huge one. It would require using a connection from her past life. A book merchant in the city whom Jiang Feng had often used to source rare texts for his own collection. The man was discreet, but reaching out to him was a breach of every unspoken rule in this household. It was an act of defiance. But defiance was the only thing keeping her alive. Using stationery from her bare writing desk, she composed a short, simple note. To Master Kuo of the 7 Pages Bookshop. The client seeks a full set of the Garden of Ancients. Inquired discreetly. Reward is no object. She didn't sign it. She used a generic seal from her dowry chest. Bribing the most skittish of the junior maids with a silver hairpin was terrifyingly easy. The girl's eyes nearly bulged out of her head at the sight of such wealth for such a simple task, to have the note delivered by a family member when she next went home. The transaction was done in frantic, silent whispers in a shadowed corridor. Then the waiting began. Each day was agony. Had the maid betrayed her? Had Master Kuo found it suspicious? Every time Shen Wei looked in her direction, her heart stopped, convinced he could see the treason written on her face. Weeks passed. The first true autumn chill settled over the compound. Lin Xing's hope began to wither. It had been a foolish, reckless idea. Then a package arrived. Not for Shen Wei but for her. The steward brought it to her quarters, his face a mask of perplexed disapproval. It was wrapped in plain brown paper and tied with twine. Her hands shook as she undid it. Inside, nestled in straw, were 4 volumes. The leather bindings were worn but intact. The pages, when she carefully turned them, were filled with the dense, beautiful script of the commentary. It was not the full set but more than half. A note in a neat, unfamiliar hand was tucked inside. The rest are elusive. Inquiries continue. It was him. He had found them. For a long moment she just stared at the books. They were her gamble made real. Now came the even greater risk, the offering. She chose a moment she knew was part of his immutable routine. The hour after his evening meal, when he would retire to his private library for 1 hour of reading before returning to work. She washed her face, rebraided her hair and put on a fresh, simple robe. She did not take the jade pin. She wanted no symbols between them. Holding the books, she walked to the door of his library. It was slightly ajar. She could see him inside, seated at a large desk, his back to the door, silhouetted by a single lamp. The room was a cavern of shadows and knowledge. She knocked softly. There was a long pause. So long she thought he might simply ignore it. Then a curt, enter. She pushed the door open and stepped inside. The air smelled of old paper, ink and dust. It was the scent of him. Shen Wei turned, his expression one of impatience at the interruption. His eyes fell on the books in her arms, and the impatience vanished, replaced by blank incomprehension. I was going through my dowry items, Lin Xing said, her voice sounding too loud in the sacred silence. She held the books out, her arms trembling slightly. I found these. I have no use for them. I thought, perhaps your library might be a better home. She placed them on the edge of his desk and took a step back, her heart hammering against her ribs. Shen Wei's gaze dropped to the books. He didn't move. Then, slowly, as if handling a holy relic, he reached out and pulled the top volume towards him. He opened it. His sharp, intelligent eyes scanned a page, then another. His fingers, usually so still, traced the characters with something akin to reverence. He looked up at her, and for the first time there was no ice in his gaze. There was only pure, unadulterated shock. The walls of his study, which had felt impenetrable, seemed to waver. Where did you get these? He asked, his voice low, stripped of its usual cold precision. My dowry, she repeated, the lie tasting like ash and hope on her tongue. He knew it was a lie. The Lin family were minor officials, not collectors of such obscure, priceless texts. But the how and the why were clearly secondary to the what. He was holding a piece of his life's work. He looked from the books to her face and then back to the books. The confusion in his eyes was absolute. He had dismissed her as an irrelevant disruption, a frivolous girl. And yet she had just placed a key to his deepest ambition in his hands. He didn't thank her. He seemed incapable of speech. He simply stared at the books, then at her, as if trying to solve a complex philosophical paradox that had suddenly taken human form. Lin Xing didn't wait for dismissal. She had thrown her stone. She had chipped a tiny fissure in the ice. She bowed her head slightly and retreated, leaving him alone with his shock and the 4 volumes that had just rewritten the first chapter of their marriage. Chapter 5. The Value of a Different Mind. The silence in the Shen compound the next morning was different. It was no longer an empty void. It was a charged stillness, thick with unspoken questions. Lin Xing could feel it humming in the air as she took her solitary breakfast. The steward served her tea with a new, almost wary deference. The maid who had delivered the package avoided her eyes but performed her duties with a new, frantic efficiency. Shen Wei was nowhere to be seen. Lin Xing's heart thrummed with a nervous energy. Had her gambit worked? Or had she merely given him a reason to lock himself away even more permanently, suspicious of her unexplained gift? The hours stretched taut and endless. She tried to read one of the bland classics from her shelf, but the words blurred before her eyes. It was late afternoon when the summons came. Not from the steward but from Shen Wei himself. A young page, one Lin Xing had never seen before, appeared at her door, bowing so deeply his forehead nearly touched his knees. "The master requests your presence in the library, madam." The walk to his library felt longer than her journey in the wedding sedan. Her palms were damp. She smoothed her robes, took a steadying breath and entered. He was at his desk but he was not working. The 4 volumes she had given him were laid out before him like sacred artifacts. He looked up as she entered, and the expression on his face was not one she had ever seen before. The cold detachment was gone. In its place was a look of intense, bewildered concentration, as if he were trying to decipher a text written in a language only she could read. "Sit," he said, the single word lacking its usual command. It was almost an invitation. She sat in the chair opposite his desk, her back straight, her hands folded in her lap. He did not speak for a long moment. He simply looked at her, his gaze traveling over her face as if seeing her for the first time. "These texts," he began, his voice careful, measured. "They are significant. Their provenance is unusual for a bridal dowry." It was not an accusation. It was an opening. A question. Lin Xing met his gaze, her own heart pounding. "I have always had an interest in stories," she said, which was not a lie. "And the stories behind texts are often as fascinating as the texts themselves." It was a deflection, but a graceful one. He absorbed this, his sharp mind turning it over. He seemed to accept it for now. The how was less important than the what. "The arguments within," he said almost to himself, his fingers resting on one of the open pages. "They are challenging long-held interpretations of the doctrine of the mean. The author posits that balance is not a state of stillness, but a constant dynamic negotiation." He looked up at her, and for a flickering moment she saw not the scholar but the man, a man genuinely excited by an idea. It is a radical but not entirely unsound perspective. This was it. This was her chance. Not to impress him with knowledge she shouldn't have, but to offer a perspective he could never have. "Is it so radical?" Lin Xing asked, her voice soft but clear. She leaned forward slightly. "Is it not what a merchant does every day? He must constantly negotiate the balance between buying and selling, risk and reward, to keep his business alive. It is not a still point. It is a tightrope." The analogy landed in the quiet room. Shen Wei stared at her, his brows drawn together. He lived in a world of abstract principles. The gritty, practical reality of commerce was beneath his consideration. To have his lofty philosophical text compared to a merchant's ledgers should have been an insult. But he didn't look insulted. He looked intrigued. "A tightrope," he repeated slowly, testing the shape of the word. "A continuous act of adjustment to prevent a fall." He was silent for a long moment, turning the idea over in his mind, examining it from all angles. An interesting parallel. He didn't dismiss her. He didn't chastise her for her simplistic comparison. He considered it. Emboldened, Lin Xing pressed on. "It seems to me, husband, that the most profound truths are often just common sense, written in a very complicated way." She offered a small, tentative smile. Perhaps the ancients were just very good at describing what everyone already knew how to do. A sound escaped Shen Wei's lips. It wasn't quite a laugh, but it was closer than anything she had heard from him before. It was a short, surprised exhale of amusement. "You reduce 1,000 years of philosophical discourse to common sense," he said, but there was no heat in the words. There was instead a dawning curiosity. "I only mean that the value of a text might not just be in its complexity," she said, feeling her way forward carefully, "but in how its ideas can be understood and used by people who have never read it." She had done it. She had taken his sacred text and suggested its value lay not in its isolation, but in its application. It was the absolute antithesis of everything he stood for. And he was listening. He didn't agree with her. She could see the disagreement in the set of his jaw. But he was engaging. The wall was not down, but a door had been opened in it. An unconventional view, he said finally. But his eyes were thoughtful as they rested on her. He looked from her face to the books and back again as if reassessing the value of both. "Thank you," he said, the words stiff but unmistakably genuine. "For the texts." Lin Xing bowed her head. "It is my honor to see them put to good use." She rose to leave, her legs feeling slightly weak. As she reached the door, his voice stopped her. "Lin Xing." She turned. He almost never used her name. He was still seated behind his desk, the scholar once more, but the winter in his eyes had thawed just a degree. "I am working on a commentary regarding the nature of ethical governance. I would be interested to hear your thoughts on its practical application when it is complete." It was not a command. It was a request. An acknowledgement that her common-sense perspective held a value his complex discourse might lack. "I would be happy to, husband," she said, her voice steady despite the wild beating of her heart. She left the library, closing the door softly behind her. She stood in the hallway for a moment, breathing in the still, silent air. It no longer felt suffocating. It felt expectant. She had not tried to become a scholar. She had not tried to speak his language. She had spoken her own. And he had listened. The value of a different mind, she realized, was not in its ability to mimic, but in its ability to offer a view from outside the walls. And for the first time, Shen Wei seemed to be looking out through the door she had opened. Chapter 6. The Illness That Binds. The fragile truce that began in the library was a delicate thing. Shen Wei did not suddenly become a doting husband. The compound remained silent, his routines immutable. But a subtle shift had occurred. He now acknowledged her presence in the halls with a slight, almost imperceptible nod, rather than looking through her. Occasionally, over their silent, separate meals, he would make a passing comment about his work, a complex idea he was wrestling with, and then fall silent, as if offering her the opening she had once clawed for herself. Lin Xing learned to choose her moments. She would offer her common-sense perspectives sparingly, framing them as questions rather than assertions. Would a district magistrate not face a similar dilemma when his people are hungry and the imperial granaries are full? She was learning the art of weaving her practical world into the tapestry of his theoretical one. It was a slow, meticulous process, like coaxing a wild animal to eat from her hand. She was making progress, but the distance between them still felt vast, the walls of his study still imposing. Then the rhythm of the compound was shattered. It began with a cough. A dry, rasping sound from behind the closed door of his study that echoed in the hallway. The next day, Shen Wei did not emerge at his usual pre-dawn hour. When the steward took in his morning tea, he found the master still abed, his face flushed with fever, his body racked by shivers. The silent fortress descended into a panicked, silent chaos. The steward, whose expertise lay in maintaining order, was utterly out of his depth. The servants fluttered like frightened birds, unsure of how to proceed. The physician was summoned, doses of bitter medicine were prepared, but the man at the center of it all was retreating into a feverish delirium, stubbornly insisting between coughs that he was well enough to work. Lin Xing heard the commotion from her room. A cold dread, different from the chill of loneliness, seized her. This was not part of the plan. Sickness was an unpredictable variable, a vulnerability the great scholar Shen would never allow. She found the steward wringing his hands outside the bedchamber. "He will not take the medicine consistently, madam. He is difficult." Without a word, Lin Xing took the bowl of dark, pungent liquid from his hands and entered the room. The air was thick with the smell of illness and stubbornness. Shen Wei was propped up in bed, papers scattered around him, his brush trembling in his hand as he tried to write. His face was pale and sheened with sweat, his eyes bright with unnatural fever. "You should not be here," he croaked, his voice rough. "I have work." "Your work is to get well," Lin Xing said, her tone firm, brooking no argument. It was the voice she'd used to manage the merchant's large household, a voice of command that had lain dormant within her. She took the brush from his unresisting fingers and set it aside. She gathered the papers, ignoring his weak protest, and placed them on a far table. Then she sat on the edge of the bed and held the medicine bowl to his lips. "Drink," she said, not unkindly, but with an authority that surprised even her. He glared at her, a flicker of his old, icy self. But the fever had weakened him. With a defeated sigh, he drank the bitter concoction, his face contorting in disgust. And so she took charge. The steward and servants, relieved to have direction, fell into line behind her. She organized a rotation for his care. She ensured the medicines were taken on time. She cooled his fever with damp cloths, her hands steady and capable where the servants had trembled. During the worst of the fever on the second night, his defenses crumbled completely. The stern scholar vanished, replaced by a frightened, vulnerable man. He tossed and turned, his words slipping into incoherent, anxious mutters. "Not enough. The presentation is flawed. Father will see. A disappointment." The words were broken, but the meaning was clear. The weight he carried was not just academic ambition. It was the crushing expectation of a legacy, the deep-seated fear of being deemed inadequate. Lin Xing stayed. She didn't try to shush him. She simply sat in the chair beside his bed, a steady presence in the chaotic darkness. When his muttering became more agitated, she did something she had not done since she was a child. She began to tell a story. Not a story from the classics. A folk tale. A silly, whimsical story about a clever rabbit who outwitted a boastful tiger. A story her own nursemaid had told her. Her voice was soft but clear, a thread of normalcy in the feverish night. His restless movements stilled. His breathing grew less ragged. He was listening, his fever-bright eyes cracked open, watching her in the dim light. She told him another story. And then another. Stories of cunning farmers, of mischievous fox spirits, of simple truths winning over complicated power. They were the stories of the common people, the world he so often overlooked. Slowly the tension drained from his body. The muttering ceased. His eyes closed, and for the first time since the illness began, he fell into a deep, natural sleep. Lin Xing watched over him until the dawn light crept into the room. The formidable, untouchable scholar Shen Wei was gone. In his place was just a man, exhausted and vulnerable, his hair stuck to his damp forehead, his hand lying open and relaxed on the coverlet. A strange feeling bloomed in her chest, warm and protective. This was not the exhilarating defiance of challenging him intellectually. This was something quieter, deeper. She had seen the cracks in his armor, the boy who still feared his father's disapproval, and instead of feeling triumph, she felt a surge of empathy. When he awoke later that morning, the fever had broken. He was weak but lucid. He found Lin Xing still in the chair, dozing lightly, a half-finished bowl of broth for him cooling on the bedside table. He did not speak. He simply watched her, his expression unreadable. The memory of the previous night, of her calm authority, of the silly stories that had anchored him, hung between them. The illness had been a siege and it had broken down the gates. The walls between them were not just cracked, they had been breached. He was no longer just her husband, the scholar. He was Shen Wei, the man. And she was no longer just an inconvenient wife. She was Lin Xing, the woman who had commanded his household and quieted his demons. Chapter 7. A shift in the silence. The fever broke, but the man who emerged from it was not the same one who had fallen ill. A profound weariness had settled into Shen Wei's bones, and with it, a quietude that was different from his usual stern silence. The driven, relentless energy that had fueled his all-night study sessions was gone, replaced by a contemplative stillness. He was convalescing in his chambers, too weak to return to his study but too restless to truly rest. The servants continued their efficient, silent ministrations, but the atmosphere had changed. The fear was gone. In its place was a watchful curiosity, directed not just at the master, but at the mistress who had steered them through the crisis. Lin Xing brought him his meals herself. It was not a duty she assigned. It was a right she had claimed in that feverish room. She would set the tray before him, and instead of leaving immediately, she would linger. She would adjust the window screen to let in a sliver of sun, or comment on the unseasonable warmth of the day. At first he said nothing. He would eat in silence, his gaze distant. But he did not dismiss her. One afternoon she entered to find him not in bed, but sitting in a chair by the window, a blanket over his knees. He was staring out at the perfectly ordered courtyard, but his eyes were unfocused. A sheaf of papers, the beginnings of his commentary on ethical governance, lay untouched on a small table beside him. Lin Xing set the tray down. "The physician says you may walk in the courtyard tomorrow if you feel strong enough," she said, her voice deliberately light. Shen Wei didn't turn. "There is little point," he said, his voice flat. "The perspective is the same from every angle." It was the first time he had expressed something akin to dissatisfaction with his environment. Lin Xing's heart gave a little leap. She followed his gaze to the rigidly placed rocks, the immaculate gravel, the bamboos standing at stern attention. "It is very balanced," she offered carefully. "It is stagnant," he replied, the words so quiet she almost missed them. The admission hung in the air, shocking in its honesty. The perfect contemplative garden he had designed was, to him, a reflection of a mind that felt stuck. Seizing the moment, Lin Xing did something reckless. She walked to the door and called for a servant. When the young maid appeared, Lin Xing gave a quiet instruction. The girl's eyes widened, but she scurried off. A few minutes later she returned, carrying a small portable writing desk and 2 cushions. Lin Xing took them and carried them to the center of the room. She set the desk before Shen Wei's chair and placed 1 cushion on the floor beside it. Then she sat, folding her legs beneath her, and looked up at him. "You cannot go to your work," she said, meeting his puzzled gaze. "So perhaps your work can come to you." She gestured to the papers on the side table. "You said you would value my thoughts." He stared at her, at the writing desk, at her informal posture on the cushion. It was a breach of every protocol. Wives did not sit at their husbands' feet to discuss academic treatises. Wives certainly did not arrange such scenarios themselves. But the memory of her steady presence during his illness was still fresh. The memory of her stories in the dark. The wall of his pride had been vitiated by fever. Slowly, hesitantly, he reached for the papers. He placed them on the small desk. He did not pick up a brush. He simply looked at them. "The argument feels circular," he said finally, the words seeming dragged from a place of deep frustration. "I am defining ethical governance by the standards of the ancient kings, but the ancient kings' standards are what I am using to define it. It is a closed loop." Lin Xing listened, hearing not just the academic problem but the personal one. He was trapped in his own methodology. "Perhaps," she began, choosing her words with care, "the ancient kings were not writing a manual. Perhaps they were just very good rulers describing what worked for them." She looked up at him. "Is the goal to replicate their specific actions, or to understand the principle behind their success?" Shen Wei was silent, his eyes on his text but his mind clearly turning her question over. "For example," Lin Xing continued, feeling her way, "if a king reduced taxes after a flood to help his people, is the lesson reduce taxes after floods? Or is the lesson help your people when they are in need?" It was her merchant's mind again, cutting through the abstraction to the core transaction. Shen Wei's finger tapped lightly on the paper. "The latter is the principle. The former is merely the application." "So should your commentary not focus on the principle?" she asked gently. "And perhaps offer newer applications? From more recent history? To show the principle is still alive, not just a relic." She was suggesting he step outside the canon of the ancients. It was heresy, but it was also the only way forward. He didn't answer for a long time. The silence in the room was no longer empty or tense. It was productive, full of thought. Then he did something extraordinary. He picked up his brush, dipped it in the ink she had set out, and drew a single firm line through an entire paragraph of his text. Lin Xing's breath caught. He began to write in the margin, his characters swift and sure. He was not copying ancient wisdom. He was synthesizing, creating. He worked for a time and she simply sat, a quiet witness to the unknitting and reweaving of his thoughts. Eventually he paused and looked down at her as if suddenly remembering she was there. "Your perspective is unorthodox," he said. But there was no criticism in his tone. There was instead a dawning respect. "It is only the perspective of someone standing outside the library looking in," she replied softly. A faint, almost imperceptible smile touched his lips. It was gone in an instant, but she had seen it. It was the first true smile she had ever seen from him. He returned to his writing, but the energy was different. The stagnation was gone. Lin Xing rose quietly and left him to it. As she walked back to her own rooms, the compound felt different. The silence was no longer a wall she was pounding against. It was a shared space. It had shifted, and in its new form there was room for her, not as a disruption, but as a part of its very structure. She had been let inside the fortress not as a conqueror but as a welcomed guest. Chapter 8. The partner acknowledged. The convalescence period ended, but the new rhythm established in Shen Wei's sick room did not. He returned to his study, but the door was no longer a barricade. Often it was left slightly ajar. An unspoken invitation. Lin Xing no longer waited to be summoned. She would enter quietly, sometimes with tea, sometimes with a question about the household accounts, a matter she now managed with an efficiency that would have made her merchant husband proud. She would sit on the cushion that had become her unofficial spot, a scroll of her own in her lap, and simply be present. The silence they shared now was a companionable one. He would write, she would read or tally figures. Occasionally he would break the silence not with a pronouncement but with a query. The legalist school argues that human nature is inherently selfish and requires strict laws to control it. Your thoughts. It was no longer a test. It was a genuine desire for her perspective. Lin Xing would set her own work aside, consider the question from the angle of her own experience and answer. Does a merchant trust his business partners because the law says he must, or because mutual profit is a better incentive than mutual suspicion? She might reply. Perhaps laws are the bones of a society, but trust is the muscle that moves it. He would grunt, sometimes making a note in the margin of his text. He never said she was right, but he always considered her words, folding her practical real-world logic into his theoretical frameworks. One afternoon he was preparing for a crucial meeting with the Chancellor of the Hanlin Academy, a powerful patron who could significantly advance his career. The weight of the occasion hung heavily on him. He was meticulously organizing his arguments, his movements sharp with a tense anxiety Lin Xing recognized. It was the same fear she had heard in his feverish mutterings, the fear of being found lacking. He was so absorbed he didn't hear her enter. She watched him for a moment, this brilliant man rendered vulnerable by his own ambition. She saw him fumble with a scroll, his usually steady hands betraying his nerves. Your collar is crooked, she said softly. He started, looking up as if seeing her for the first time. His hand went to his neck, frustration flashing across his face. Without a word, Lin Xing crossed the room. She batted his hand away gently and began to straighten the stiff, embroidered collar of his official robe. Her fingers were deft and sure. He stood frozen under her touch, his breath held. The Chancellor, she said, her voice calm and conversational as she worked, is a man who rose from a provincial magistracy. He is proud of his practical experience. He has little patience for pure theory. Shen Wei looked down at her, his brow furrowed. How could you possibly know that? He did know. She knew from the gossip and assessments that had flowed constantly through her first husband's house, where the rise and fall of court officials was a common topic of conversation. But she just offered a slight shrug. I listen. The servants talk. His son is known for his extravagant tastes, which the Chancellor despises. He values frugality and practicality above all. She finished with his collar and took a step back, surveying him. Your argument about the irrigation reforms is your strongest. Focus on that. Frame it not as a philosophical ideal, but as a practical solution that increased the imperial tax base by 20% in 2 provinces. He will care about that. He will not care about your analysis of the ancient king's moral codes. She was not just straightening his robes, she was coaching him, giving him the social and political intelligence he, in his ivory tower, utterly lacked. Shen Wei stared at her, his earlier frustration replaced by dawning comprehension. He had been preparing to talk about the why. She was telling him to talk about the what and the how. She was giving him the key to his patron's favor. He did not thank her. He simply turned back to his notes, a new focus in his eyes. He began shuffling them, moving the scroll on irrigation reforms to the top of the pile. When he left for the meeting, his posture was different. Still straight but no longer rigid with fear. It was filled with purpose. The hours he was gone stretched long. Lin Xing found herself unable to concentrate. She paced her room, then the courtyard, her earlier confidence giving way to a nervous anticipation. Had she overstepped? Had her advice been too simplistic? Would he fail and resent her for it? Finally, she heard the main gate open. She hurried to the hallway, her heart in her throat. Shen Wei entered. His face was flushed, not with fever but with a subdued energy. He saw her waiting and stopped. For a long moment they just looked at each other. "It went well," he said, his voice low and charged with something she couldn't name. Relief washed over her so powerfully her knees felt weak. "I am glad," she whispered. He walked toward her until he was standing right before her. The distance he had always maintained was gone. "The Chancellor was impressed," he said, his dark eyes holding hers. "Particularly with the irrigation analysis. He said it was refreshing to see scholarship that understood its application in the real world." He paused, the words seeming difficult to form. "He has offered me a position on the board for economic policy review. It was a monumental achievement. A direct path to influence." Lin Xing's smile was brilliant and unreserved. "Shen Wei, that is wonderful." He continued to look at her, and the intensity in his gaze made her breath catch. "He asked me who my political advisor was," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "He assumed I had hired one." The air left the hallway. Lin Xing could only stare, her smile fading into shock. Shen Wei took a final step, closing the last of the space between them. He did not touch her, but his presence was overwhelming. "I told him I had no advisor." He paused, letting the words hang between them. "I told him I had my wife." The acknowledgement was so vast, so profound that Lin Xing had no words. He had publicly credited her. He had not hidden her contribution or dismissed it as woman's intuition. He had named her as the source of his success. "I wanted a wife who would be a silent asset," he said, his voice thick with an emotion that sounded like awe. "A quiet manager of my household. You are not that." He finally reached out, his hand hesitantly coming up to brush a stray strand of hair from her cheek. The touch was electric. "You're a partner. An indispensable one." Lin Xing's eyes filled with tears. They were not tears of sadness or frustration, but of a validation so deep it shook her to her core. The vibrant, clever girl who had been told her whole life to be quieter, to be smaller, had just been seen for exactly what she was. And she was valued for it. The wall was not just down. It had been dismantled, and in its place stood a bridge, built from shared intellect, mutual respect, and a partnership neither had ever dreamed of. She was no longer just his wife. He was his partner. And in that moment, Lin Xing knew she had found not just a refuge from her past, but a future she had never dared to imagine. Chapter 9. Redefining Happiness. The word partner hung in the air of the Shen compound, transforming it. It was a silent decree more powerful than any shouted order. The servants, ever perceptive to the shifting winds of power, now looked at Lin Xing with a new deference. Their inquiries were no longer just about meal choices or laundry. They were about scheduling, about which invitations to accept or decline, about the management of the household budget. She was no longer the mistress of the house in name only. She was its commander. And Lin Xing flourished. The energy she had once spent on battling the silence was now channeled into building a life within it. She discovered that structure was not a cage if she was the one helping to design it. With Shen Wei's tacit approval, a nod, a murmured, "Do as you see fit," she began to make the compound her own. She started small. She introduced more variety into their meals, arguing that a well-fed mind worked better than a deprived one. She replaced the stark white flowers in the main hall with arrangements that had bursts of color and interesting textures. Shen Wei, to her surprise, commented on one not with criticism but with a simple, "That is, lively." It was high praise. Her greatest project began with the other scholarly wives. In her first life, isolated in the merchant's compound, she had craved society. Here she realized the wives of Shen Wei's colleagues were just as isolated as she had been, trapped in their own silent homes, their minds starving for connection. She began to host a weekly salon. Not a grand, formal affair, but an informal gathering over tea and light sweets. She called it a discussion on household management, a suitably bland title that would raise no eyebrows. But the conversations she fostered were anything but bland. She would pose a question, a philosophical one from Shen Wei's work, stripped of its academic jargon. If a district magistrate finds a law is harming the people he is meant to serve, what is his greater duty? To the law or to the people? The wives, many of them sharp and underutilized, would light up. They would debate, offering perspectives shaped by their own experiences managing complex households and navigating family politics. Lin Xing was in her element. She was the conductor of a symphony of intelligent conversation, drawing out the quiet ones, gently moderating the passionate ones. The salon became a coveted invitation. The Shen compound, once a place of dreaded silence, became a hub of intellectual social activity. Shen Wei would sometimes pass by the open door of the reception room on his way to his study. He would pause, hearing the animated chatter, the occasional burst of laughter. At first he looked perplexed, then thoughtful. He never interrupted, but Lin Xing would sometimes later find a text left on her desk that pertained to their discussion. His silent, scholarly contribution. One evening, after a particularly lively salon had ended, he came to her private sitting room. She was tidying up, her cheeks flushed with the success of the day. They were debating the merits of centralized versus regional grain storage, he said from the doorway, his tone one of pure academic curiosity, as if he'd observed a fascinating new species of insect. Lin Xing smiled, stacking teacups. Indeed. Madame Li, the finance minister's wife, made a compelling case for regional storage reducing spoilage during transport. It was quite insightful. He murmured, entering the room. An practical consideration often overlooked in policy debates that focus solely on control and distribution. He picked up a forgotten fan, turning it over in his hands. You have created something here. It is just tea and conversation, she said modestly. It is a network, he corrected, his sharp eyes seeing the underlying structure she had built. An informal advisory council. The chancellor's wife was here today. She rarely socializes. Lin Xing paused, realizing he saw the political utility in her social gathering. And he wasn't disapproving. He was impressed. It seems my wife is not only a political advisor but a skilled diplomat, he said, and there was no mistaking the note of pride in his voice. This was her happiness. It was not the unbridled freedom she might have once dreamed of. It was a happiness carved out within the confines of her world, a happiness of influence and intellectual engagement. She had not shattered the walls of the scholarly life. She had built beautiful, bustling rooms within them. She was using her mind, her charm, her energy, all the things that had once been deemed too much, to become a power in her own right. She was Lin Xing, the scholar's wife, the hostess of the most sought-after salon in the district, the woman whose opinion her husband not only tolerated but sought. She looked around the room at the traces of the day's conversation, and then at her husband, who was watching her with an expression that was no longer one of bewildered curiosity, but of settled respect. She had redefined what it meant to be a wife in this quiet world. She had found a purpose that fit her perfectly, and in doing so she had built a version of happiness that was uniquely, powerfully her own. The silence of the Shen compound was now a canvas, and she was finally allowed to paint it with color. Chapter 10. A Poem of Devotion. The culmination of Shen Wei's efforts was not a quiet affair. The announcement of his appointment to the prestigious Hanlin Academy was met with a flurry of activity. Official messengers came and went, scrolls of appointment were presented with great ceremony, and the compound, for the first time in its existence, buzzed with a palpable celebratory energy. A banquet was arranged. It was a necessary formal event, a chance for Shen Wei to be feted by his peers and to acknowledge the patronage that had elevated him. The great hall, usually so austere, was filled with the low hum of scholarly conversation, the scent of fine food and wine, and the rustle of silk robes. Lin Xing stood at the periphery, a perfect image of the scholarly wife. She wore a robe of deep, respectable blue, her hair styled elegantly but simply. She greeted guests, directed servants, and ensured the event ran with seamless efficiency. She was the calm, competent center of the storm, and she glowed with a quiet pride for her husband's achievement. This was the world she had helped him navigate, and she was content to remain in the background, the power behind the throne. Shen Wei was the picture of academic triumph. He accepted the congratulations with a dignified composure, his responses measured and intelligent. He was in his element, surrounded by the respect he had worked his entire life to earn. The formal toasts began. The chancellor spoke glowingly of Shen Wei's brilliant mind, his unwavering dedication to scholarship, his pristine moral character. Other senior academics added their praises, each one layering on the accolades. It was a portrait of the perfect scholar, untouchable and revered. Lin Xing watched, her smile fixed in place. This was his moment. This was the pinnacle of everything he had ever wanted. And she was happy for him. Truly. Then it was Shen Wei's turn to speak. He rose and the hall fell silent, expecting a speech of humble gratitude, filled with quotes from the classics and acknowledgments of his mentors. He stood for a moment, his gaze sweeping over the assembled crowd of the most powerful minds in the capital. His eyes found hers, holding them across the room. "I thank you all for your most generous praise," he began, his voice the familiar, measured tone of the scholar. "The path of learning is long, and it is one I could not have walked alone." He paused and the silence stretched. It was not the empty silence of the past, but a waiting, anticipatory one. "It is customary," he continued, his words beginning to slow, to become more deliberate, "to thank one's parents for their guidance and one's teachers for their wisdom. And I do. Profoundly." He bowed slightly in the direction of his old master. Then he straightened and his gaze returned to Lin Xing, unwavering. "But a scholar's life is one of isolation. It is easy to believe that the only thing of value exists between the pages of a book. That the only truths are those already written by dead men." A faint ripple of confusion went through the room. This was not a standard acceptance speech. "I have been gifted with a most unconventional wife." A few nervous titters were quickly stifled. Lin Xing's heart began to hammer against her ribs. What was he doing? "She speaks of merchants and tightropes when I speak of philosophical balance," he said, and a genuine faint smile touched his lips for the first time that evening. "She asks me about the common sense of ancient kings. She tells me stories about clever rabbits when I am too ill to think." The hall was utterly silent now, captivated by this bizarre, personal confession. "She has rearranged my garden and my understanding in equal measure," he said, his voice gaining a softness she had only ever heard in the privacy of his study. "She has built a home that is no longer a silent library, but a place of dynamic balance." He reached into the sleeve of his robe and withdrew a scroll, not an official document but a simple sheet of fine paper. He unrolled it. "I am a man of the written word. It is the only language I have ever trusted. So I have written a poem. Not for the academy. Not for the canon. For my wife." Lin Xing's hands flew to her mouth, her eyes wide with shock. Tears, unbidden, welled up and spilled over. Shen Wei began to read, his voice clear and strong, filling the silent hall. The poem was not a flowery sonnet about beauty. It was a scholar's poem, precise and structured, but its subject was her mind. It praised the sharpness of her insight, the practicality of her wisdom, the unorthodox music she had brought into his silent world. It spoke of a partnership, of two different melodies finding a harmony more beautiful than either could achieve alone. He had seen her. Not just her usefulness but her essence. And he had written it down in the language he revered most, and he was declaring it to the world. When he finished, the silence held for a breathless moment. Then the chancellor, a man known for his severity, began to applaud. It was a slow, deliberate clap that was quickly taken up by the entire room, not in polite obligation, but in genuine admiration for the profound and unexpected tribute. Shen Wei did not acknowledge the applause. His eyes were locked with Lin Xing's. He rolled the scroll and walked through the crowd, which parted for him. He stopped before her and held out the poem. "For you," he said, his voice quiet now, meant only for her. "My partner." Lin Xing took the scroll, her fingers trembling. It was the heaviest, most precious thing she had ever held. It was not cold jade. It was a testament, a declaration, a shared truth. She looked from the poem to his face, and she saw the man she had built a life with. The boy who feared disappointment had become a man secure enough to declare his debt to a woman in public. The cold scholar had learned to write a love poem. The applause faded around them. The guests, the promotion, the academy, it all fell away. There was only this moment, this man, and the profound, quiet happiness that flowed between them. She had not just found a place in his world. She had helped him create a new one, a world where a scholar's value could be measured not just in scrolls, but in the strength of the partnership that supported him. She had her happy ending, and it was more fulfilling than any fantasy. It was real, it was earned, and it was written in a poem just for her. Bonus chapter. the library of a shared life. 5 years had not softened the sharp lines of Shen Wei's face, but they had gentled the expression that resided there. The relentless drive for approval had been tempered into a quiet, settled authority. He was a respected, tenured member of the Hanlin Academy, known not just for his brilliant commentaries, but for his surprisingly pragmatic approach to policy, a trait that baffled his peers and delighted his patrons. His home, the Shen compound, was no longer a silent monument to scholarship. It was a living, breathing seat of intellectual influence. The sound that greeted him upon his return from the academy was no longer the echo of his own footsteps, but the lively, intelligent chatter emanating from his wife's salon. He paused in the courtyard listening. Lin Xing's voice, clear and confident, rose above the others, guiding a debate on the ethical implications of new trade routes with the western regions. He heard the wife of the Minister of War offer a strategic perspective, and the wife of the chief archivist counter with a historical precedent. It was a symphony of sharp minds conducted by his wife. A small figure detached itself from the shadows near the carp pond and ran toward him. Baba. Shen Wei, their son, was a whirlwind of contained energy. At 4 years old, he possessed his mother's bright curiosity and his father's serious dark eyes. He clutched a toy wooden boat in one hand. Shen Wei scooped him up, a gesture that had once felt awkward but was now as natural as breathing. "And what port are you sailing to today, Captain?" "To find the Koi King," Shen Wei announced, pointing his boat toward the pond. Shen Wei carried him inside, nodding politely to the gathered ladies in the reception hall. They smiled and bowed their heads, their respect for him now intertwined with their genuine affection for his wife. Lin Xing caught his eye from across the room mid-argument, and her face lit up with a quick, private smile before she returned to her debate. This was the new music of his life. It was not the silent, solitary hymn he had once composed for himself. It was a complex, beautiful opera, and he was no longer the sole composer. Later that evening, after the guests had departed and Shen Wei was asleep, they retired to his study. The room was still a sanctuary of books and scrolls, but it was no longer a fortress. A second writing desk had been placed near the window, where Lin Xing kept her household accounts and correspondence. A vibrant watercolor painting by Shen Wei was pinned to a bookshelf, a splash of joyful chaos amidst the orderly texts. Shen Wei was working on a new essay. Lin Xing sat at her desk reviewing invitations. "The Chancellor is hosting a mid-autumn celebration," she said without looking up. "He specifically requested we both attend. His wife values your opinion on the proposed tax reforms in the South, and she wants to hear my thoughts on the social implications for the merchant guilds." She said it casually, as if it were the most normal thing in the world for a Hanlin scholar's wife to be consulted on state policy. Shen Wei grunted in acknowledgement, his brush pausing. "The proposed tax structure is flawed. It fails to account for regional crop variance. It also assumes all merchants are equally prosperous," Lin Xing added, setting down an invitation. "It will crush the smaller traders, creating a monopoly for the large guilds like the Jiangs." She spoke the name without a flicker of nostalgia. Jiang Feng was just a successful businessman, the husband of her sister. In fact, not a ghost. Shen Wei considered this, his mind already weaving her practical observation into his theoretical framework. An astute point. The social instability caused by destroying the smaller merchants could outweigh the short-term revenue gains. He made a note in the margin of his text. This was their dance, their partnership. He provided the depth of historical and philosophical context. She provided the living, breathing reality of how policies touched people's lives. He finished his thought and set his brush down. His eyes fell on the top shelf of his bookcase, where a simple Zetenwood box sat apart from the others. He stood, retrieved it and brought it to her desk. Lin Xing looked up, curious. He opened the box. Inside, nestled on the dark silk, lay the white jade bamboo hairpin. It looked even colder and more severe against the warm, lived-in clutter of her desk. "I kept it," he said, his voice quiet. "A reminder of the life I had planned. A life of perfect, solitary order." Lin Xing looked at the pin, then at him, her expression soft. "I thought I wanted a wife who was like this pin," he continued, picking it up. It looked fragile and out of place in his capable hand. Cold. Perfect. Unmoving. He held her gaze. "Instead, I got a summer storm. You rearranged my furniture and my thoughts. You filled my silent house with debate and my life with noise. He said the word not with distaste but with wonder. He placed the pin back in its box and closed the lid. It is a relic of a man I no longer recognize. Lin Xing reached out and covered his hand with hers. And what does the man you are now want? Shen Wei turned his hand to intertwine his fingers with hers. His grip was firm, sure. He wants his partner, he said simply. He wants the noise. He leaned over and kissed her, not with the desperate passion of a young man, but with the deep, abiding tenderness of a man who had found his other half. The kiss spoke of shared struggles, mutual respect, and a happiness that was built, not found. Later, as they prepared for bed, Lin Xing noticed the Zeton wood box was gone from the shelf. She didn't ask where it was. Some relics were meant to be put away, their lessons learned, their shadows banished by the bright, complex, and beautiful reality of the present. The library of their shared life was now filled with a different kind of text. A painting by their son, a household ledger, a poem written for a wife, and the quiet, unwavering certainty of a love that had been earned chapter by chapter together.